saying who I am. I'm Sander Tordoir. I'm Senior Economist with the Center for European Reform. We want to thank Europe Unlocked for supporting the research that is presented today and that will be discussed, which is Better Regulation in Europe, an action plan for the next Commission. The EU has made significant progress in ensuring its lawmaking is rigorous and evidence-based in recent years, but many stakeholders, including maybe some in this room, remain worried that the EU's lawmaking is still opaque, unpredictable at times, and results in too many unnecessary costs on business. In fact, European businesses are far more likely than their American counterparts to cite regulation as a major obstacle to doing business. So as Europe searches for ways to boost economic growth and frets about its competitiveness, I don't think I need to tell this room that there are 2 reports from former Italian PMs coming on this issue soon. The question is, how can the EU ensure that regulations also are conducive to productivity and more innovation? And so I'm excited to have this panel with me today to explore how the EU has met its commitments to better regulations in recent years and how long-standing problems with its lawmaking process can be improved. And so we have with us Zach Meyers, my colleague, Assistant Director at the CER, who authored this report. Michael Wimmer, Director for Strategy, Better Regulation and Corporate Governance at the Commission, Secretariat-General. Wolfgang Hiller, Director for Impact Assessment and Foresight in the European Parliament Research Service. Jörgen Warborn, a member of the European Parliament. And Lotta Nymann-Lindegren, who is EU Director for the Confederation of Finnish Industries. And so maybe to start, Zach, would you kick us off with telling us about your report and what we can learn from it to start the debate?
Thanks, Sander, and also thank you to Europe Unlocked for supporting the report. I think it comes at a time when there is growing recognition that the European economy is not on the right track. Productivity growth for quite a while now has been anemic. The motors of past growth, like German manufacturing exports, are facing structural challenges. And the EU has missed out on being the leader in many recent rounds of technologies. The problem is not, I would say, only competitiveness in the narrow sense of lowering the cost of doing business compared to Europe's rivals, but it's also the fact that the European economy is less dynamic than America's. Startups find it more difficult to succeed here. The best firms find it harder to scale here than in America, and firms are less free to experiment and find ways to incorporate new technologies. Now, of course, regulation has a really important role in addressing that situation. We need new business models in Europe and more economic dynamism, and that means that we need to focus on making it easier to open and to close a business, giving firms more freedom to change business models, to experiment, to modernize, to innovate. And we need an environment where the most successful firms can grow not only within a particular member state, but across Europe. In that way, dislodging the less productive firms, shifting labour and resources towards the most productive businesses, and enhancing European growth, echoing the same sort of dynamic that we see in the US. As Sander said, European firms cite regulation as a barrier to doing business much more often in Europe than they do in the States. In some cases, that may be firms complaining about democratic policy decisions, but in other cases, I think that there are really legitimate complaints, and we've seen these in recent years, where there are good cases that regulation is not being carefully designed, where it's not being led by the evidence, it's not properly targeted at the precise problem that's been identified, and it's not being applied in a consistent way and then implemented and enforced across the EU so that we actually develop the single market, which is, of course, our greatest economic strength. And this is where I think the better regulation agenda has a really strong role to play. My report has some suggestions on what the EU needs to do, but I think it is also important to provide some context here. So the European Commission leads the world in following better regulation practices. It compares very well against most countries in terms of consulting widely, assessing impacts of its proposals, and reviewing legislation to check that it's still fit for purpose. But I think that we can still observe, and anyone who talks to businesses can observe, that there is a widespread perception that the quality of regulation in the EU has not always been as high as it should be, particularly in recent times. and that regulation is not always building on the EU's economic strengths like the single market, and that burdens have increased. And so my report tries to ask why that is, why there's this difference between the commitment to better regulation in terms of procedures and practices and what's on paper, and what businesses are experiencing. I think one reason for this is understandable and possibly temporary, and that's the fact that in recent years the EU has had to deal with a lot of quite urgent crises, from Ukraine to the pandemic to Chinese and American subsidies, and that has meant that decision makers have had to act decisively and with imperfect information. But I think there are some structural reasons here too. One of them is that the Commission is getting growing powers over time, and we've had 2 Commission presidents now who have been quite focused on making the Commission a more political or geopolitical body. These trends are important, and I think that on the whole that they have positive elements. We are facing a fragmented world, a more dangerous world. We need an EU which can act decisively and in a unified way. But we have to be honest that they come at a cost, and we see that, I think, in terms of the shape of regulation. 2 examples of this are that, firstly, a more political Commission will be a bit less technocratic and a bit more focused on things like newspaper headlines and politics. And so consequently, I think we can see a mismatch between the letter of better regulation and the perceptions that the spirit of it is not necessarily being followed. And secondly, I think a more political Commission will have different incentives, or at least the perception of having different incentives. For example, the Commission's more political role means that it can sometimes find it difficult to step back and play the bad cop, which is necessary sometimes, for example, when the Commission needs to take action against member states for not properly implementing EU laws, or in terms of like the trilogue process when member states are looking to either be able to gold plate or to seek opt-outs, and in that way not have a consistent law across Europe. And the same applies, I think, in terms of private enforcement of laws against the private sector. Companies need confidence that the Commission is acting objectively and impartially rather than being driven by headlines and PR. My report recommends several steps that should, I think, reinvigorate the better lawmaking agenda across the whole policy-making cycle, from making laws to implementing them, and finally to keeping regulation under review so that we don't normalise the costs of compliance. I won't talk through all of them here because we've got experts who are going to engage on some of the details of the recommendations, but they cover 4 main areas. The first is strengthening procedural checks and balances within the Commission. So that covers the lawmaking process, so making sure that stakeholders have confidence that consultations and impact assessments are genuine opportunities to change the Commission's thinking. And also making sure that we have laws that are more likely to be targeted, consistent and predictable. An alarming problem, I think, for example, is the growth of delegated laws in recent years, which give the Commission very broad powers and are not subject to the same level of scrutiny as primary laws. Secondly, I think we need stronger independent bodies able to scrutinise the Commission's approach, such as the Regulatory Scrutiny Board, which I talk about quite a lot in the report, but also it includes other bodies like the European Court of Auditors. Of course, those bodies also need to be accountable. Some of them have come under criticism in recent years, and I think we need to take that criticism seriously and engage with it when we try to strengthen these bodies so that they can play a role as a check and balance against the Commission. Thirdly, I think Parliament, and even more so the European Council, need to take on more responsibility for ensuring better regulation. Many of us will be familiar with examples where the Commission has done a really good job in carefully designing proposals, only to see them get radically changed in the trilogue process in ways that are no longer reflect the sort of impact assessment that was originally undertaken. And so we really need to see member states and MEPs step up to the plate and do more to assess the impacts of their own amendments to proposals. And finally, I think we need to strengthen the burden reduction agenda. The Commission has done quite a lot here, and I really commend them on that. But the focus has very much been on administrative and reporting costs, not on the full impacts of regulation on the EU economy. As someone who works mostly in kind of the tech policy field, I think this is a key concern for me, because when you look at recent laws like the AI Act, a simple impact assessment that's focused on administrative and reporting costs is not going to capture the impact of these laws on innovation, competition, and the EU's global competitiveness. And so we really need to broaden what the burden reduction agenda covers. So clearly we're going to need, I think, both a combination of strengthened procedures and practices, which I think the Commission in particular has already developed well, but we need that to be matched by political commitments, and that has to be across all of the lawmaking bodies in the EU, particularly member states and MEPs. So very much looking forward to hearing from my fellow panellists on these recommendations, but I think that we probably all share the same goal here, which is to make sure that Europe is the best place to start a business, to grow a business, and a place where the best firms can expand across the EU and use that as a launchpad to be globally successful.
Thank you, Zach. Mr. Wimmer, maybe you can give us a bit of a sense on the Commission perspective on the better regulation agenda. A few questions just to get you going. So how would you respond to the views that the quality of legislation has declined in recent years from the Commission side? How would the Commission respond to concerns from businesses more widely? And is the potential for the Regulatory Scrutiny Board that Zach discusses in the report being fully realized? And finally, what's your take on the competitiveness check? And can it be effectively implemented? So with that, we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much. Quite a few issues, and thanks also, Zach, for your report and for the ground that you covered, which is of course very broad. And I think I certainly subscribe to the objective that you have mentioned, and I think we are mobilized on that. I will stay with better regulation and with the system as it works. I think reports like this, and also I think meetings like this and moments like this are good moments to reflect about what we can improve. Because from my perspective as Director for Better Regulation, regulation is never good enough. It's never as good as it should be, and there's always ways that we can do better. At the same time, in relation of some of these things, it's maybe also important to explain a little bit how the system works. Because better regulation, of course, also has a cost. Better regulation costs time, better regulation costs resources, and it's important to direct those resources to the core work of better regulation so that we can really make a difference. Because the objective can, of course, not be to create a new bureaucracy or new processes just for the sake of it, but really to make a big difference. And against that backdrop, many thanks for your recommendations. Some of these recommendations I can share. I would probably argue that quite a few of those things actually happen already, but there are other elements that we can reflect upon, and maybe some issues also where we do not completely see eye to eye. My starting point is, and thank you for having mentioned that, Zach, that overall I don't think we shy away from any comparison. I think we are very consistently rated by the OECD as top performers in the world, and certainly if you look at our member states, as I said, I think we are doing pretty well, but always obviously worth improving. The second point that I wanted to make, and I think you have mentioned that as well, is that the better regulation agenda and the better regulation as part of the policy agenda is active as it has never been actually under this mandate. You're right, and that is of course contributing to the perception that you have been mentioning. This has been a very active commission. We have had to put on the table quite a lot of things because we were facing important crises. We had COVID, you mentioned COVID, the Russian war of aggression, the climate crisis. We really had a very challenging mandate, and I think overall, if you look at how the Commission has dealt with that situation, I think most would argue that considering the circumstances, I think this has been done pretty well. We had sometimes to act fast, that is true, but in terms of our system, we have a very mature better regulation system. We have the experience now of 20 years doing this, and I think that's important. But what is also important, and I think here you're also very right, it is precisely because of those challenges, precisely because of the fact that this is a difficult time for businesses to digest quite a lot, that we have placed a very, very strong focus, in particular in the last year, on administrative burdens, and we are already starting to deliver on this. There's clearly momentum politically, but also if you look at what we have done. And I mentioned here just the 25% reduction of reporting requirements, which we have started to work on a year ago. We have since then put on the table 41 measures to rationalize reporting requirements, including legislative measures. If those measures, or when these measures will be adopted, they amount to administrative simplifications to the tune of some 4 billion euros. So this is quite significant. We have launched a number of evaluations, fitness checks, 16 of those just linked to that exercise so far. And of course, there is further work ongoing in the Commission. We're using artificial intelligence to map, to see further rationalization potential. We have conducted a public consultation. Many of you have contributed to that. We had close to 300 contributions, also directing us on where the key issues are from the perspective of businesses. There's a lot of emphasis, of course, on things like sustainability reporting, digital requirements, things that are actually not yet in force, but will come to force. And part of our work that we are doing here is also to try and help and make sure that this transition can be as smooth as it can be by developing guidance, help desks, proxies, whatever, just to support you also very practically. There are some other measures as well, postponing some important sustainability standards. We have looked at the thresholds of, for example, the accounting directive, which will exempt quite a significant number of companies of some of these things and many other things. IT, digital, you mentioned this is super important. We're looking in those things. The energy platform, for example, is a good example of promising ways of helping and simplifying things. We have the Interoperability Act, which will require us very soon to do interoperability assessments as part of our preparation of legislative proposals. Data sharing are things that we will be looking at very systematically, because of course the more things can be done automatically, uploaded and whatever, the easier things will also be for our companies. Third, Zach, I think you have also, I'm not sure whether you mentioned it, it is very prominent in your report, and I think indirectly you mentioned it. 1 in, 1 out is of course something that is an important new innovation that has taken place under this mandate. This is our cost break. We are fully applying this since 2022. And if you look at the results that this has given, it is a resounding success as far as we're concerned. We have for 22 a net burden reduction of some 7.3 billion. We will soon publish the annual burden survey for 23, the second year where we have applied it. We will have a number of several billion of cost reductions. I hear what you just said in terms of the broader assessment, but on that I would want to make 2 comments, namely number 1, first of all, we are doing a broader assessment. All the compliance costs are part of the 1 in, 1 out approach. We are having that in our impact assessments. We do not treat all cost elements in the same way, because from our perspective that would not necessarily make sense. For example, we have a very strict offsetting requirements, and it would be very difficult to see how, for example, you would compensate an administrative burden versus, for example, a decreased political ambition. This would be very complicated to do. But the bottom line is these elements are, of course, part of our analysis. We are trying to compensate them to the greatest possible extent. And there are also other tools like, as you mentioned, for example, the competitiveness check, some other elements that are relevant here. 4th point, you insist rightly very much in your report on the fact that there is a need to systematically look at burden reduction potential. That is the point of our REFIT program. If I just look at data that I have here, 2020-22, we have done 72 evaluations. We have put forward, or the co-legislator has adopted 39 initiatives to reduce burdens. We have 26 REFIT initiatives that are pending, so this is a very active agenda as well. We are doing impact assessments. As you know, that's probably one of the best known things of our and I'll come to the part, don't worry, of our system. We have done 70 impact assessments in 22, 50 in 23. And here the basic principle is that we do an impact assessment whenever there is a likely significant impact, whatever the level of legislation is. In most instances, this will be secondary legislation, I mean, basically level 1 legislation, but we are also doing impact assessments for delegated acts when that is, when that act in itself is creating such an impact. Of course, there are the numbers here are different because very often the content of a delegated act is somehow predetermined in the legislative act. The Regulatory Scrutiny Board, a very important point, and on which you want me to comment. The board is looking at all those impact assessments, of course. They continue to be very tough with our services, and I think that's rather good. 42% of all our impact assessments in the first submission are getting a negative opinion, requiring services to do additional work. And there, maybe if you look at just the graph that you are giving here as well in your report, the graph refers to first submissions, not the final impact assessments, which is, of course, the point of the Regulatory Scrutiny Board process, namely to improve between the first submission and what actually then is the final impact assessment. It's a very important element. We believe in a strong Regulatory Scrutiny Board. It is strong, it is independent. We have reinforced it last year by 2 members, with a particular emphasis also on the competitiveness dimension in order to really strengthen very specifically that dimension. And we have accompanied this also with a new requirement that we have in our impact assessment system, the competitiveness check, which is relatively new. We have introduced it less than a year ago, so it's obviously permeating. It's starting to become part of our culture. The impact assessment has looked at some 30 of such checks, and obviously it is commenting and trying to improve the impact assessments as it should be. But in terms of coverage, we are really looking at all the 4 key dimensions of competitiveness: price competitiveness, international competitiveness, the capacity to innovate, and in particular then also the SME dimension. And also in particular on SMEs, we have been very active. We have put forward the SME relief package. We have just recently appointed the SME envoy, a very high-profile person in our system, with particular rights also in the interaction with the Regulatory Scrutiny Board. No one else so far has those kinds of possibilities with the board. So this is, I think, rather important elements. And of course, we have also still the Fit for Future platform, where many of you, I mean, some of you are business organizations and also other civil society organizations, the Committee of the Regions, other, are helping us to really try and simplify our legislation, identify ways where we can make a difference and where we can where we can move forward. Last 2 or 3 sentences, maybe, because I guess you want me to conclude as well, but I think it's important to give the whole picture. Obviously, as I mentioned, this is a moment where there's a lot of reflection, both at political level and technically, about the future. I am obviously not in a position to give any political view on this one, because that will be for the next president, for the next commission to do, and is also part probably of the political discussion. We are, though, preparing this. I think our assessment, my personal expectation is that better regulation will be a very important priority under the next mandate. I believe that there will be a very strong focus on things like implementation, single market competitiveness, regulatory delivery, and in particular also this agenda that I've been mentioning and which we have been very active in the last year on burden reduction, which will really be important. We are, as I said, confident in terms of our starting point. We have a really good system. I'm not shying away of any comparison, and want to see the member state who does not only better, but even as good as we do. But there are many reasons as well to always improve, including some of the reasons that you mentioned, Zach, at the beginning. I think we have an obligation to get the best out of this. In particular, on the burden reduction side, there will be a lot of investments. We have rationalization plans. Our services are preparing rationalization plans with some 170 things that they are working on, and that they will want to deliver, or that we will want to deliver in the future. So there is a lot of work to be done. There's room for improvement always. And I think there's also a continued emphasis on, and that's maybe the transition, on our cooperation, of course, also with the other institutions, with the member states, because obviously this agenda at the end of the day can only work, and you can only feel the benefits of this if it arrives really in the laws and in the implementation of these laws. There's a little bit of there's a certain time lag, but importantly, there also needs to be a very strong and shared commitment to take that agenda forward, and everyone needs to work together here, and that's, I think, what we will need to strive also for the next mandate.
Great, thank you so much. Mr. Hiller, maybe you can give us a bit of a sense on from the Parliament's perspective. There have been many steps taken to improve the Parliament's institutional capacity for better regulation, but there's also quite a way to go still. For example, when it comes to preparing impact assessments for substantial amendments. So how can we improve this situation? And maybe on a strict regulatory note myself, just a bit conscious of time, so if you could keep it somewhat brief, that'd be great.
I will do my best. In any case, first of all, thank you very much for having me. Thank you also for the report, which I found very interesting. I'm also very happy that, in fact, we are two from the Parliament here, but we are here in different roles. Looking very much forward then to the discussion, but as a sort of introduction, let me confirm that the European Parliament as an institution is firmly committed to the better lawmaking agenda and to the principles of it, both as a procedural process as well as a policy objective in itself. For that purpose, as you have rightly pointed out, and as you have also thankfully acknowledged in the report, we have developed over time a significant institutional capacity, providing a number of dedicated services to support members and parliamentary committees with better lawmaking tools throughout the whole policy cycle. This includes both ex-ante impact assessments and ex-post evaluations, as well as European added value work and recently also stress testing to be complete. We believe that in order to get good quality results, we need to look at the whole policy cycle, not just ex-ante, but also ex-post, and that we learn from that. I'm therefore pleased that I can say that interest in Parliament on better lawmaking products, both ex-ante and ex-post, has grown substantially over time. And that can be seen over many years now. As far as our services are concerned, they are therefore not just on offer, but the parliamentary committees use them, however, to various degrees. Let me briefly explain. On the ex-ante side, in the area of ex-ante, we scrutinize systematically Commission's impact assessments, but we also offer additional own impact assessment for committees. This includes detailed appraisals of Commission impact assessments, complementary or substitute impact assessments, or impact assessments of substantial amendments. All of this is done on request. Of course, we also monitor if there are legislative proposals that are not or will not be accompanied by an impact assessment. And if that's the case, we alert committees about it. And we know that there is the intention not to have any of those, and I think the Commission has improved quite significantly on it, but there have been cases in the past where there was no impact assessment, such on the asylum and migration package, and then we did step in on request by the committees. On the ex-post evaluation side, we support parliamentary committees whenever they decide to draw up a parliamentary implementation report to be voted on in the House. Parliament adopted around 60 reports of this kind during the legislative term, and for most of them we have provided so-called implementation assessments as input to this work. With all this, the European Parliament, I think, is quite unique amongst parliaments. In fact, the European Parliament is one of the few, if not the only parliament in Europe, if not worldwide, with a holistic and institutionalized process at both ends of the policy cycle to analyze and evaluate legislation. To put things even more into perspective, Better regulation is in general, in the member states, a matter for governments. And whenever we in the European Parliament point out to our colleagues in national parliaments that we are investing in this, they very often simply smile at us and think that we apparently have too much money to spend. However, at EU level, this is fortunately different. Better lawmaking at EU level is a joint responsibility of all institutions and stakeholders beyond, and rightly so. If I may say so, we are very happy that your report acknowledges what we have already done. We are, however, very much aware that more would be nice to have, and in addition, there will be new challenges and new topics we possibly may have to address in the future. We, however, face limits and constraints, and while there is no time to go into much detail now, I would like to simply mention and comment on some. First, we think it has already been somehow become apparent there is need for cooperation. We need to recognize that in the field of better lawmaking, like in any good team, not everybody should and can do everything, but together we can do a lot. It means that at the level of the EU, it is in fact indeed the Commission who bears most responsibility for better lawmaking. And if they get it right in the beginning, when they do the proper design for what they propose, there's not so much need for us to complement or duplicate their work. This is even more important as, in spite of all its potential benefits, the process of better lawmaking is and can be costly. As researchers, we are of course happy to assume that more studies, more consultations and more evaluations will lead to better laws and regulation. In practice, however, we need to be careful that all this work indeed adds to the quality of decision making and not only to the balance sheets of the consultants which we employ. In order to add values to the process, we therefore have to choose very carefully when to invest in better lawmaking related scientific work. This even more as a parliamentary service, human resource and budget-wise, we work on a much smaller scale than the Commission. Also, we need to acknowledge that time is a factor. The dynamics of the legislative process and the political environment mean that sometimes complex research should be done under very tight deadlines, literally in parallel to the already ongoing legislative process. And there's a huge pressure to finish process, and I think everybody knows that there's this expectation that laws are adopted immediately, and that the time frame for laws to be considered is getting smaller and smaller. So there's a lot of pressure, so this is really a contradiction. And finally, we need to accept that better lawmaking tools and process inform policymakers but cannot replace the political process, something neither governments or elected members would ever accept. Given these factors, additional impact assessment work by Parliament needs to be considered by case by case. This is why we need broad political agreement in the responsible committees on if and what exactly should be assessed. This is in particular true for amendments, and I'm coming to the amendments finally, and explains why Parliament only rarely conducts impact assessment studies on amendments. As administration, of course, we stand ready to do more, but for that we need a political mandate. And it is difficult to get this political mandate for a number of reasons. One of them is time, as I mentioned. The other one is the sheer number of amendments tabled and decided in Parliament. In plenary, it's thousands and thousands. And the difficulty to determine what is substantial or not. I would be tempted to say a few more things about implementation, but maybe we can come back to this during the debate.
Thank you very much. Yeah, we can definitely get into that in the debate. I wanted to now turn to Mr. Warborn. Thank you for joining us. It's a pleasure. You and your colleagues are making these amendments, and I'm going to ask you sort of the big question, which is how can these more political institutions, the Parliament and the Council, how can they better integrate the long-term consequences of lawmaking Because of course passing a law is the goal of politics, but then how do we bring that in more? And I'm curious to hear your reflections.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you very much for this report as well. I think it will be very useful for us in the further discussion of this topic. First of all, let me bring us back to I would say, the reason why we are here, and that is not only regulatory burden, because I would say it is mainly about European competitiveness. And we indeed have a problem in Europe. We have a big problem. Because if I look back to the statistics 15 years ago, EU and US, we were at pair. We had the same size of our economy, and since then Europe has been growing, but not at all like the US. And there is no reason why we should have it like this, because of course it's up to the policies that we adopt here in Europe that of some reason makes European businesses grow less than the US businesses. And we can change this, and we need to change this, because if we let the next 15 years be like the past 15 years, well, then we will be the poor part of the world. I compare to US because we have similar industrial history, I would say. But if, of course, if we look at Asia, it is even worse. So we have to do a major shift in our policies if we are going to change the situation. And one part of that, of course, is the regulatory burden. And let me tell you a story. Let me tell you the story of when I first met the Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen. She was not Commission President, but she wanted to become. She came to our group, and as you know, I'm an EPP member, and so is she. She wanted to convince us of why we should support her. And the first question I asked her was, what will you do about combating the regulatory burdens, so regulatory costs for businesses? And she said like this, 1 in, 1 out. Directly, 1 in, 1 out. I will launch the principle of 1 in, 1 out, which I think is, or was, a very good answer. This was back in 2019, and as you know, 1 in, 1 out means that you calculate the cost of the businesses for a piece of law, and then you promise to deduct the same amount of cost when it comes to the administrative burden. Well, it took some time before this principle became efficient. I think 2022, I think. 21.
21 was a
You had a test in 2021, and then in 2022 it became like the major principle. And I'd like to applaud the Commission for introducing this principle, because first of all, it means that the Commission actually acknowledged that regulatory burden is a problem for European competitiveness. And that, of course, is the first step to understand that we have a problem before you can fix it. And that is good. But, of course, I'm a bit disappointed that it took so many years to launch it. I can, in a sense, understand. We had COVID, we had Ukraine, there was a lot of issues that happened, so I can understand that. But 1 in, 1 out means the same. And we need to reduce the administrative burden. That would be my main message here today. And since it is only on the administrative burden, we are, of course, increasing the burden during this legislative term. First of all, given the fact that we launch it in the middle of the legislative term, and then that it's only the administrative burden and not the total regulatory burden. So when the Commission said that now we have a cost break, well, it's not a cost break. It slows down the cost, but it's still an increase of the cost, and that is a problem, and we have to realize that, I think. And this is also the next thing. We have been talking about the impact assessment, and they, of course, is really important. They are really important for better lawmaking, better regulation in general. But for the 1 in, 1 out principle, you can never have the 1 out if you don't calculate the cost, and the cost is calculated in the impact assessment. So you absolutely always need to have the impact assessment. And it is a bit too often, I would say, that I have to deal as a member of the European Parliament with a legislation, with a proposal that does not have an impact assessment. And that has to change. And we can, of course, in the Parliament, ask the EPRS to make the impact assessment. The problem is that I find it very, very hard to get a majority for that, because I've tried to do that several times. So I think we should make a deal in the Parliament and say, if there is no impact assessment, we should send it back and we should not deal with it until the Commission comes back with an impact assessment, and do that all the time. The Parliament, of course, has to work with impact assessment for our amendments more than we are doing that. We're basically not doing it, and it is really important. But it's also very hard to get a majority for that, I can assure you. But I'm trying to fight that. Then let me say something on reporting, because I'd also like to applaud the Commission for the initiative of reducing the reporting by 25%. But it will not help. 25% of the reporting, the way I see it is that you have the regulatory burden, and that is everything. That is all the cost that comes with the proposal. And out of the regulatory burden, you have the adjustment costs, and then you have the administrative cost. And of the administrative cost, you have the reporting cost. And it's that part of the bigger picture, it's the reporting cost that the Commission now will reduce by 25%. I mean, it is a good step, but it is a small step. And I think we should aim higher than that. And I think we should actually have an ambitious goal of reducing the regulatory burden by 30%. And we should do that by introducing the 1 in, 2 out. And let me say, it will be very hard for the Commission. I understand that it is really hard. It's really hard with the 1 in, 1 out. But I think we have to be more aggressive than that. So 1 in, 2 out. I also have one small suggestion, and it is not the EPP suggestion, it is not my Modry party suggestion, it's my own personal suggestion. Has to do with a disclaimer here, I guess. And that comes with the reporting thing. Because I think the Commission should pay the businesses for reporting. So every time an authority, if it is the Commission or a member state or a local level, the entrepreneur, they should get paid for providing this service to the public. Because if you have that solution, I think the Commission will ask themselves, first of all, do we really need this information? And second of all, if they decide that they need it, they will ask themselves, well, maybe we already have it. So maybe we can ask someone else, and then businesses don't need to report twice. I said this is a personal idea. It's a bit creative, I think so, and I can see some drawbacks with it maybe, but I think we need to push it here. We really have to push it here so that we reduce the regulatory burden. And if we can do this on a European level, if we can reduce it by 30%, and if we can reduce it by 30% on a member state level, because we have issues with gold plating and with a lot of issues with the member state level as well, and if we can do it on the local or regional level by 30% as well, well, 30% here, there, and there, then I'm sure we will increase the competitiveness and we can turn the situation around and we can start growing at least at the same pace as US. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Nymann-Lindegren, we are, especially after that impassionate call, curious to hear from the business perspective how you look at competitiveness an EU regulation, and how urgent is the need for improvement, given also some of the improvements that the other panelists have laid out?
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me to this very distinguished panel. I have to say, I really commend the report that you have made, as many of the other speakers as well. I think it highlights the right questions to look at, and I think that many of the ideas that have already been said in this panel are extremely useful. Maybe to start with a bit of a different perspective, I think this is often a very difficult topic to talk to, and also as a business organization, I feel that better regulation sometimes has an image problem. And I would really want to underline that talking about better regulation and the need to reduce the regulatory burden, which is really important and which can make a difference also when it comes to competitiveness, should not be seen as anti-European or as a criticism towards the Commission or the role of the Commission, which we find very central and appreciate. And it's not a way to questioning, at least it should not be seen as a way of questioning the ultimate political goals. Just as an example, if you look at just the Nordic industries and the twin transition, I think we're an excellent example of that an ambitious climate policy can be a key driver for growth. And the fact that we want better regulation when it comes to reaching for instance, our climate and sustainability goals does by no means mean that we do not share these goals and want to reach them. And I think this is an issue we need to somehow overcome, because otherwise better regulation becomes a debate about something it's not a debate about. What we want to say is that we want to have more freedom to choose what works best, because it's often the companies that need to make the difference on the ground, finding the concrete solutions, and because local conditions differ a lot around Europe. Another thing I would want to say, taking a bit step back also, is yes, the answer to your question is this urgent and does something have to be done? Yes, it is. And in addition to all of these good things that have come forward in this panel, and we also recognize from the side of the industry the weight that this commission and the past commissions have given to this topic, and have really tried to think of different practical ways to solve it. But what I think we need most at European level is a growth mindset, is a change of how we look at these things. And that's why we hear many positive echoes about what the Commission is thinking for the next legislative period, and I think these are very, very positive. But we need of a regulatory framework that delivers the goals. So much more focus on how to encourage the creation and commercialization and speedy uptake of innovations, for instance, to solve the problems that we are at hand. So the competitiveness check, which Zach, you also talk about in your report, is a very good idea, but as a more general approach. So you should integrate it into the thinking and start by asking what is the goal that we want to reach? Do we need regulation for that? Can we use other instruments? And in which ways can we at best achieve the results and the ambitious goals that we all share? And I think our goal as industry should be to be the partner very early on, both for our national governments and at European level, to give you this input about how does this work in practice, what are the practical consequences, what could be done better or differently, and if this is the goal you want to reach, let us discuss how to best reach it, so that the regulation as such does not become the goal, but that we keep focusing on the big political goal that we want to reach. A few points that you don't address in your excellent report, which I wanted to highlight because they haven't been mentioned before. One of them is the external aspect. For instance, trade policy and our relation to our partners. So the type of regulation that we make also has an impact on the relationships that we have with our trading partners and the rest of the world. So it's not only something that should work for us, but it should also work for our partners, at least be understandable and clear enough so that they know what it is that we want to achieve with this regulation, and that it does not appear something we have just thought of because we are afraid of the competition or we want to protect our markets. And so these are often the picture that our partners have particularly when it comes to, for instance, sustainability regulation. That these are important goals that we want them to share, but to have a better dialogue on how to work together so that we can reach these goals. So the external dimension is extremely important. And another one is we've talked a lot about burden reduction, which is really important for the industry and particularly for the SMEs. But another aspect is the cumulative effect of regulation. So if you're a company on the ground, I understand that in the Commission and also in the Parliament, you sit in a certain committee or in a DG and you prepare the regulation on energy or on sustainable materials or fuels or transport or whatnot. But the company on the ground has to fulfill all this. And especially for the smaller companies, sometimes just understanding all the regulation that applies to them, and it can be contradicting as well in terms sometimes. We have examples like the deforestation regulation, where you have EU-supported programs that help farmers build barns, and afterwards, when they had to cut down trees, they find out that that's actually illegal and their products can't enter the market anymore, and things like this. So sometimes the left hand doesn't know what the right hand does. So it's not only that individual instruments need to be clear and easily transposable, but also the effect of somebody being at the receiving end of all this regulation should be looked at. So when we talk about this competitiveness check, also trying to see that from the point of view of the other end. Reporting requirements is another great example. If you're a small company, maybe you're too small to be actually covered by the legislation, but then you're maybe producing materials to 3, 4, 5 different big companies who all have their different reporting requirements. So you end up having 6 different channels that you need to respond to, although you're not kind of part of the regulation. So in trying to see this from the point of view of the players on the market who actually are the ones helping us reach the political goals is really important. And then just as a joker, because it's something you didn't talk about at all, but AI, I'm looking a lot at different options here, but I'm not saying that somebody can do the impact assessments for us in the future, maybe that as well, but also looking at the companies who figure out what regulation applies to them, search engines and intelligence that help them see if they just type in the branch they're in and the product they're doing, all the information they can help. So we should also use artificial intelligence and knowledge-based solutions to make it easier to operate in the regulatory environment. I think that would be a great help for at least many of the smaller businesses. But very happy to engage in discussion afterwards, and thank you for your good inputs.
Great, thank you so much. I was just in a discussion on global climate finance, and there were a few African diplomats there who actually brought up the issue you mentioned on the external dimension, and brought in concerns, for example, about CBAM and what it would mean for their country. So I think it's a very good point. Even though it wasn't a topic, it came up, so it seems to be alive. I'm happy to say we have about half an hour for Q&A, so I'd be very keen to hear from all of you in the room. Don't be shy, ask questions to this excellent panel, challenge points or bring in others. The floor is yours, so maybe raise your hand if you would like to speak. The gentleman over there.
Yeah, Stefan Moritz, Secretary-General of European Entrepreneurs here at EME, Confederation of SME Associations. I like very much Mr. Warborn's proposal that the Commission should pay for the reports. I would even suggest not the Commission, but the quoted company that requires that, because it's only quoted companies on the stock market, of course, which need this kind of
Thank you very much. Maybe just to summarize, because without the mic, that will not be on the recording. I think you made 2 points. One was instead of 1 in, 2 out, it should be 2 out and 1 in, to put the emphasis the other way around. And you raised some concerns about the reporting obligations as a method, as a fundamental. Okay, thank you for these points.
Outsourcing public administration tasks to private companies, first of all, but also guaranteeing by law that the stock market quoted companies get for free the reports that they need for their investors.
Okay, thank you very much. There was another question, I think. Oh, right behind you. We jumped right into the discussion, but if you could use the microphone, that would be very helpful.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Martinas Barisas. I'm from Business Europe. And my question is more directed maybe towards Mr. Warborn and Mr. Wimmer. And the question is very simple. Don't you get the impression that in the debate around better regulation, after flashy political statements, all the process, all the debate drowns in a very technical discussion, and we lose the political focus? And I will explain what I mean by this. I mean, let's take the reporting requirements with a very good political commitment at the start. And now it seems that we are kind of getting drowned into nitty-gritties. Are there inconsistencies? Are there overlaps? Which are maybe important details. But I'm afraid that we are drowning in all that and losing a very simple fact. What does a reporting requirement mean for a company? It means expansion of compliance function within the company. It means hiring people, having more money for the administrative compliance with some requirement, instead of having research people, instead of having business operations being improved, instead of investment in technologies. And at the same time, Europe says, okay, we'll be strategically autonomous, I don't know, in pharmaceuticals, in artificial intelligence, and at the same time, we are just taking away the resources from that. I think that's my perception, that we are losing this focus. Nice statement, and then we are all drowning in technical details. So my question, do you agree with that, or you feel it differently? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Maybe I collect one more question, and then we return to the panel. And I'm pretty sure we still have one more round. So if there's any other question, there, great. Please go ahead.
Okay, Christina Forss from the Board of Swedish Industry and Commerce Better Regulation. Thank you very much for a very good report. I found many of the recommendations we from our side, the business side in Sweden, we could totally agree with. And thank you also for the other ideas mentioned by Jörgen Warborn, for example, and Lotta Nymann here. I was going to ask about, it was mentioned the cumulative regulatory burden, which is very important to business and also needs to be taken into account when doing impact assessments, for example. How is this taken care of by the Commission, for example? And how can it be considered also in the European Parliament at the next stage?
Great, thank you so much. I think, Zach, let me first turn to you as the author of the report to respond to some of these questions, comments, ideas, how you could further extend
Thanks,
the work.
And I might pick up a few of the ideas that came from the panel as well. One thing I wanted to pick up was the skepticism I heard a few times about whether better regulation is leading to kind of too much bureaucracy. And I think that there is something to that. And I think that there is a couple of examples recently where we've seen that purely focusing on kind of technocratic steps is not enough and is not only not a substitute for political direction, but that political direction can be much, much more powerful. One of those examples is the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. And so this was an example where the Commission made a political decision to override the objections of the Regulatory Scrutiny Board. And it was only at the council level that I think that we saw a real pushback and a focus on whether the obligations that were getting imposed were proportionate. And so I think that was an example where you had a whole lot of procedural steps that were in place, and yet it was really the politics of the situation that led to, I think, a solution that was somewhat more business focused. And we saw the same dynamic in the AI Act as well, I think, where it was a couple of member states who were really focused on actually, do we want to put barriers to innovation in place in Europe that don't exist in other parts of the world? Look, I don't think that is at all to say that putting additional measures in place is not useful, and I think that we need to see that as putting in place kind of a choice framework that gives lawmakers as many opportunities as possible to think about all the dimensions by which a regulation or a proposal will impact Europe's competitiveness. But I think it shows that we have to think more broadly around how do we change the political narrative here, because it can't go into this very technocratic discussion that kind of loses sight of the fact that lawmakers pass laws, and that is today seen as the sign that they are successful. And we have to think, I think, much more, and hopefully the two reports that are coming out from ex-Italian prime ministers will think about this. Like, how do we make the single market kind of sexy again, and how do we get deepening it and implementing it effectively? How do we make that the sign of success rather than merely the fact that there's good newspaper headlines because the lawmakers have agreed on some compromises and got a new law passed? So I think that the political and the technocratic dimension have to sit kind of hand in hand. I really like the point also about the external dimension. I think there's been so many laws recently that really impact on the EU's foreign relations. And I mean, even leaving aside kind of the European economics angle to this, I think that there are kind of external relations impacts. I think it's made it very difficult for Europe to secure trade agreements with partners where if your focus is not just on economic growth but on economic security, it really compromises that agenda. And I feel like a lot of these initiatives were proposed without a lot of consideration about what the alternatives might be, including alternatives that would be more focused on international cooperation rather than focusing on trying to kind of exploit the Brussels effect in areas where it might be stretching it too far. But I'll leave it there and leave it to others.
That's great, thank you, Zach. Maybe Mr. Wimmer and Mr. Hiller want to respond to some of the questions and comments from the audience on reporting and the cumulative burdens and other issues.
Very happy to do so. I'll try to be not too long because I could talk for hours about these things. They're all very important and relevant. Martinez from Business Europe, is this becoming too technical? I think we need both. We need a political drive, but we also need to realize that in practical terms, this is very hard. This is very hard work because you need to, you cannot just simply cross out certain things. But I mean, reporting requirements have their purpose. Sometimes we're overshooting. Sometimes the convolution of this is not good. Sometimes they are inefficient. But there are, in some instances, reasons why reporting requirements are there. These are sometimes disclosure requirements, which are for market participants. These are sometimes for national administrations in order to enforce law. These are sometimes for us. So I think we agree, and this is the reason behind the political orientation that the President has given. We agree that this is becoming an issue, and hence she has given an extremely ambitious, I repeat, because if you apply this to the acquis, this is extremely ambitious objective of removing this, and this is what galvanizes the system. And that is very important, and that makes a big difference. But it is also a lot of technical work, practical work, and it is really very, very hard. And by the way, we are mobilizing to pick up another element that was made, I think by you. We are trying to get in place tools on AI, for example. I mean, we have developed, this is at this point a relatively simple tool to map the various things which we are then confronting services with, so that they have this top-down dimension. They say, well, this is yes, this is not. We want to develop that also, that so in the future, if we, for example, have legislation where you would look or where you would consider reporting requirements, where the system helps you to spot something that exists elsewhere. And there are many other applications and elements where this is important. Cumulative costs, indeed, are very important, a big issue. I mean, conceptually, but again, this is only part of the answer, conceptually, our impact assessments are supposed to cover that. So, I mean, the impact assessments are supposed not to only monodimensionally look at the individual proposal, but, I mean, it's looking at the baseline, it's looking at factoring that in. There are differences in the ways this is being practically done. To an extent, some of these approaches, like one in, one out, in relation to their scope, also are a way of looking in a cumulative quantitative way of what the burdens are. So in that sense, for example, one in, one out is looking at the administrative costs, granted, but in a cumulative way. And on that one, we have, Mr. Warborn, a clear outward reduction trajectory. You're raising the issue of adjustment costs, which is, though, a little bit more complicated in the overall picture as well, because what is this? These are essentially investment costs, or investments that enterprises have to take in order, and which will, in the medium term, also give them a competitiveness advantage. Now, in the short term, this is an important cost. And by the way, because you're saying the Commission should pay for those kind of things, in a way, this is what we are doing. I mean, we have a 2 trillion MFF package with Next Generation EU, 30% of which are supposed to support the twin transition, which is precisely to support and facilitate that transition. 20% of the Recovery and Resilience Facility go into digital. So there is a broader picture, in particular when it comes to adjustment costs, when it comes to compliance costs, for which the pure offsetting approach, certainly from my technical perspective, simply does not work. Granted that reporting requirements are not the whole set of administrative burden, and maybe there's a reflection to be had in terms of what to cover in relation to that. I mean, I think roughly, but this is very rough, you can say reporting requirements are roughly half of what we have in terms of overall administrative burden. But again, 25% applied to the acquis is an extremely ambitious objective, and I think that is also important. And finally, maybe this point on small companies. This is also very interesting, also because it illustrates that this is actually in practice a very complicated conversations. We do have today instances where there are no European rules on some aspects, on small companies. There are rules on big companies, but not on small ones. We do have then cases where, or many instances where the big companies are actually asking the small companies to apply the same demanding standards that apply to them, because there is a supply chain and so on. So that the small companies sometimes come to us and tell us, please give us our own standard, which is a more proportionate standard, which is a more limited standard. So this is something where we are asked to regulate in order to make life easier for companies. But of course, it comes across as a new burden that the Commission is putting out. The same a little bit, it's a complicated conversation also from the perspective of what you said in relation to objectives, providing objectives versus regulating. It's a tricky thing. There is a subsidiarity consideration, of course, in particular when you regulate by objective, you leave the means to a member state, to the companies on how to comply with certain things. But at the same time, in particular, if you look at the single market, you very often have an interest also of the companies to have one rule that applies across the board, which is not different and which does not leave that kind of leeway also to the member states, because that's the point of it. And here, one European rule, and that's the ideal, typical situation. I grant that. We are not living in a perfect world, but the principle is that one European single market rule replaces 27 or 20 or whatever national rules, and is actually here to help. So the overall discussion is complicated, and I think the key thing is that we're really doing the hard work, Martinas, and beyond the political target to really roll out our sleeves. That's certainly what we are doing, and work together to make a real difference on those issues.
Mr. Hiller, maybe you want to respond as well. I would like to have another round of questions, so, if possible.
Very briefly, indeed, it's more complicated, and when you said the flashy political statements and then nothing happens. In fact, that's the feeling of many people out there, and this has been also the feeling some years ago already. When I was at a discussion in Germany, we discussed about one in, one out, and they proudly presented what they had as an example for the EU. But then the business representative said, but we don't really notice all of this. And here we are in the same situation. That's why I think it is really more complicated. And it's not just the Commission who is designing things, but it's also very much about implementation. of course, ideally, in many cases, we would have one rule replacing the 23, but sometimes we have leeway for the member states who then are doing gold plating, then different forms, all these kind of things, they add to this feeling that this is really difficult and complicated. And so I think we need to work on different things and also start some new ideas. And I think the new commission, for example, would be very well advised even to have a dedicated commissioner maybe looking at enforcement and implementation. It's not an idea of mine as a good civil servant of the European Parliament. I'm not supposed to have ideas of this myself. But I've heard this at CEPS the other week, and I thought it was a very good idea. And it could even be complemented by sort of an independent panel like the RSP, who is looking at what is really happening there. And yeah, a lot more to say, but I stop.
I'm just going to look at my two other panelists if they want to jump in on this round. You then go ahead, and then we take one more round of questions.
Sure. First, to say something about the technical and political level. I actually think both is needed. And the Commission is working hard on the technical side, and that has to be done because there are a lot of details, and of course you have to work through those details. But I think from the political level, of course, we have to be very clear and send the signal on in which direction we are heading. And that's why I say we should have a very ambitious goal, and I suggest 30% reduction of the regulatory burden as total. And let's have a political fight about that, and then you turn that political fight into technicalities, and you sort it out, basically. I also think that, I mean, there is a fight in the Parliament, as I see it, on the one in, one out. There are political groups that do not like to have this principle at all, and I think that is an important political fight to take to the next legislative term so that it is kept or improved to a one in, two out. Then on the internal market, I think that, I mean, we have to put a lot of effort in the next legislative term on the internal market and improve it in a sense to make it more sexy again, because it is needed. This is the best part of the European Union in a sense. I'm searching for my English words here, but really to work on that, and not least services and digital issues so that we can increase competitiveness that way. I'm not really sure that this Brussels effect thing is the best thing to be proud of, to be honest. To always say that Europe should be ahead and setting standards for the world, I don't think that is the way innovation works, basically. I think this might turn to a Brussels defect. Because innovation works in another sense, and we have to let all the businesses not be constrained by all the rules and regulation. Too constrained. There needs to be rules and regulation, but I think the AI Act is one example of where we probably have pushed it in the wrong direction, unfortunately. On cumulative regulatory burden, yes, that of course is an issue, but I think it's very good with the annual burden survey that is presented. And remember also that the one in, one out says that you offset the cost for the same sector, which means that if you apply it, and if you would apply it to regulatory burden, not administrative burden, to the same sector, then there will be no cumulative effect, I guess, if you actually work on it. Final word on trade policy and the external factor. I think that is really important, and it ties in a bit to the Brussels effects and this being a bit ahead of the curve, so to speak. When I went to the ministerial conference of the WTO the other week or month, this comes up with all the discussions I have with parliamentarians from other parts of the world. CBAM, deforestation, forced labor regulation. It is a major issue, and I think we are in the situation when it comes to world trade that Europe has to show leadership within the WTO, and if we are pushing it so that we are close to the rules and regulation within WTO. I'm not really sure that this works in our favor. So we have to be very careful with the external dimension for the future. Thank you.
Great, then turning to our last panelist, and then one more round of questions, and then brief reactions from all of you.
I'll just, there was a brief comment regarding the security narrative and this economic security. And I just wanted to say, I think this is an extremely important issue as a whole. We really need to focus on the internal market and dismantling the barriers. At least seen from the Nordics, this was what the European integration was about for us. Having access to markets, having less barriers, having freer movement, having more competition. And in past couple of years, I feel a bit like the narrative has changed. And now we're more looking at protecting ourselves and closing ourselves from the outside world. And I think that can have very dramatic consequences also for our competitiveness if we don't watch out. So security is an important issue, but we should not let that dominate the way we think of the internal market and or competition, because there cannot be no competitiveness if there is no competition.
Great, thank you so much. I saw at least one question in the audience. If anybody, another one. So up here in the front.
So first of all, thank you very much for this very interesting discussion. My name is Susanne Jannesson. I work at Volvo Group. We are one of the world's largest producer of transport and infrastructure solution. We produce trucks, buses, construction equipment, and marine and industrial engines. And I just want to give an example from reality, CBAM. And first, I want to be very clear that we support a price on carbon. We think it's really important to keep the high ambition when it comes to the climate targets. But when it comes to CBAM, I think that, honestly, we are doing the impact assessment at the same time as we implement the regulation. And I used to be a lawmaker, so I think I have a fairly good view of what it's like. But for the first report, and based on default values, we have spent several hundreds man-hours of doing the first report. And that is then related to that we are present in 190 markets. So we report in each market where we import products that are covered by the CBAM. So I have two kind requests. First of all, thorough impact assessments together with SMEs and groups before implementing regulations. Second one, a very clear fit-for-purpose explanation of each obligatory reporting regulation that you push on us. I think that would be really, really helpful. And again, I think that you phrased it very well, Lotta, that it's not that we don't want to live up to it. We really do. But it's really, really cumbersome. So it would be really good if we can have a much closer collaboration on this. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think there was a question in the back.
Good afternoon, Anne Franke from the German Employers Association. So listening to the panel, I have the impression that both one in, one out and the -25 aim didn't work. Some political commentators tend to joke that it was in the past years more 4 in, 1 out. And looking at the legal assessment, what has been finalized in the past weeks. CSDDD, only one example. This has increased the reporting burdens immensely in the past. And I see that Mr. Wimmer is shaking his head, but indeed there is no statistic or empirical data proving that at the end of this term, indeed, the burden stemming out of reporting duties has not been increased, or that 1 in, 1 out or that minus 25% has indeed been materialized. There is no empirical data proving this. So my question is looking ahead. My question is looking into the future, the next 5 years. How can we ensure that one in, one out will work in the next term? How can we ensure that minus 25% is implemented properly? Because these 41 proposals are not sufficient. So my question to the Commission would be, what are the next steps? And my question to the European Parliament, Mr. Warborn, would probably be, what could Parliament do to be more pushy? So there are other fields where, for example, the Article 225 procedure was chosen by the Parliament to force the Commission to indeed propose legal acts which would lead to the result one in, one out, and minus 25. But I'm sure that there are other ways you and your MEP colleagues are thinking about how really make it done. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. I didn't see any other questions, so we have 7 minutes left, 8 minutes left, so maybe we go in reverse order for a last reaction of a minute or a minute and a half.
I don't think I have much to add. I thought it was a very good example on the practical consequences on the external relations. And just to echo on what I said earlier, I think it's very important that we have rules in place to reduce the regulatory burden, but that even more important is that we have this growth mindset when we do regulation. And it's not only about not regulating at all. That was not my point, but just simply always asking what level of regulation do we need to get to our goal, and making sure that those are clear, and those are the kind of rules that help Europe prosper also economically.
Okay, on the question on the one in, one out, and on the 25% reporting, did it work or didn't it work? Well, I think it did work, in the sense that once the Commission launched it, from then it has worked. It has worked on how they are designed. And I think that is very good. It shows that the Commission is working on this. But my main message is that is very good, but it is not enough. We need to do a bit more, basically. What can Parliament do then? Yes, we could of course work with our own initiatives, but I think right after the elections, we will have discussions with the new President of the Commission and with the new commissioners. We will have Q&As with them, and of course there is the golden opportunity to make sure that they all commit to stepping up the work with the regulatory burden. So you set the scene early on after the election, and that you can work for the next 5 years to make it even more successful than this period.
I think the discussion shows there's not really a hostility in principle against regulation, but it's about which kind of regulation and what needs to be in this regulation. And I myself, I would like to have at least, as little regulation as possible, because I don't like if anybody tells me what I have to do. But of course, we live in society, and this society is formulating political objectives, and somehow it needs to be translated. And there we come into this situation that we have to see what kind of regulation we do, and then later on, as this regulation thing is a cycle, we need also to somehow to evaluate, and there, of course, we also need some data. But we probably, and I think there seems to be agreement, that we probably are asking maybe also data which is too cumbersome to collect or is not necessary. So we have to really, when we do the design, we have to think beforehand what kind of data do we want in the future. And from my experience, very often data has been collected because there was a deadlock in negotiations, and then you say, let's do another report in 5 years' time, and yeah, and that wasn't really the idea. So everyone from the design to the implementation has a role to do. It's unfortunately not that easy to say, like one can, solve it in a miracle way, but we all have to work together if we want to get the political goal of more competitiveness and, yeah, in fact, competitive is there to have a better life for better people. So to get these political objectives done, we will need to work together. And it's an occasion now because the debate will be lively because we have elections. And then there will be a new program, and then politicians will set a directive, and we will have to try to, then to implement it.
Okay, thanks a lot. I'll only take the 2 points, which were I think directed in my direction, at least partly. I mean, one is the CBAM, which has several dimensions. You have the external dimension, but also the question of implementability. And I think I agree on both points in the sense that obviously it is super important to factor in at an early stage if an initiative that we have, and we're actually discussing this with our RELX-DGs as well, if an initiative has a very strong external dimension. I agree that this is something that we need to be particularly attentive. I wouldn't think that actually CBAM is the best example in the sense that on CBAM we have seen that. On CBAM it was clear, the very point of this was to have that external impact. Still, there is a reflection to be had to design those kind of tools in a way that the objectives can be combined in the best possible way. And I certainly also take the point that obviously it is important that where we have requirements, where companies need to report that we try to design them in a way that are as user-friendly as possible, and also that we are trying to support them in meeting these requirements. Maybe without going so far as to pay, but still see what can we do in terms of IT, what can we do in terms of guidance. This is a very strong emphasis that we have now on sustainability reporting. I understand I'm not an expert, apologies for that, but even on CBAM I think that there is guidance that is being worked on or finalized. But again, I'm not an expert on that. And finally, on has one in, one out worked? Have the 25% worked? I mean, I think two different answers. I mean, on one in, one out, I think an emphatic yes. I have, of course, heard the argument, well, don't we actually have 4 in, 4 out? But I'm afraid to say, I mean, who says this has just misunderstood what the approach is. 4 in, 1 out refers to the number of legal acts that have been adopted, which is a completely not meaningful metric. Because if you were to apply that metric, you would basically say that you would basically argue that the 41 proposals, for example, which aim specifically at reducing burden for companies that we've put forward in the work program, would count as an in, which would be nonsensical. We are obviously referring to the burden that is impact assessed and that we then in a very transparent way, based on best practice, using the standardized cost model, which is OECD used, that we apply and for which we do this then. Obviously, this is at the level of the Commission's proposals. Obviously, we depend on the fact that this is then being adopted, this is being taken forward, and obviously the co-legislator is free to change what we put on the table. That is just our system, and this is the reason why I said it is important that we work together hand in hand on those issues. And of course, there's also an element of delay, because once you adopt something, it takes some time until it enters into force, and until then it is felt. This is also, of course, a consideration which is there. On the 25%, I think no one has ever argued that we have reached the 25% now. I think it would be very difficult to seriously make that kind of claim if you look at the magnitude of that effort as a function of our key. This is our goal. This is a very ambitious goal, and I think what we've done in 1 year was nothing short but remarkable. But of course, no one is arguing that this is now the 25%. These 41 proposals are a start, and obviously this is part of an agenda that will need to continue. And as I said at the beginning, I think with our services we have now just identified, just for the next for the next year or so and beyond, some 180 things that they are working on in order to take that agenda forward. And obviously this will require a sustained effort on which we will be working together in order to actually meet that target.
I'll just finish with 2 points. One, I think the Volvo example is a great illustration of the fact that there's been like a really frenetic series of legislative acts, both in the ECG space and also in digital over the past few years. And I think when it comes to assessing the cumulative burden, it's extremely challenging to do that, I think, when you are passing laws or doing impact assessments which have to take into account laws which have not yet been properly implemented or let alone enforced. And so I think that there is a message here in terms of kind of thinking about all of this holistically, and that may mean kind of slowing down how much legislation we're looking to pass, which I think links into this question that, yes, there is a bit of bureaucracy involved in better regulation, but it's highly consequential to European living standards, to European competitiveness, and so it's worth doing it properly, even if that means doing less, and even if it means some difficult questions around the EU budget about having the right number of people in place to make sure that impacts are properly assessed. Finally, just on how we measure costs, I think there's been a bit of discussion here around exactly what we measure and how comprehensive it is. But one thing that hasn't really been brought up is opportunity cost. Because to me, whether you're talking about reporting costs or admin costs, they're really only the tip of the iceberg, I think, in terms of what the impact of regulation on business can be. And I think that the competitiveness test can bring in these considerations around opportunity cost. But really, if we are making it harder to adopt new technologies, to change the way businesses work in Europe, that is, I think that's really problematic. When you look at the reasons that the US succeeds, it's because their economy is far more dynamic. You have companies that can really, really quickly scale up and take over whole industries. And that promotes competition, it promotes the shift of resources to the most productive firms. That is the sort of dynamic that is causing US growth to continually outpace Europeans. And I think if we focus too much on like the static costs of businesses that are already operating today, then we may miss that. And I think, by the way, that the whole point of better regulation is not to, is to move away from a regulatory lawmaking agenda that is driven by kind of lobbying and the incumbents being able to spend the most money to get their voice heard, and making sure that we look at costs, opportunities systematically. And I think that will give a lot of opportunities to small, medium enterprises, and hopefully that them become, tomorrow's big ones. So I'll leave it there. I think that innovation should be a big part of the better regulation agenda.
Great, thanks so much. We're 5 minutes over time, so the first thing to replace with AI would be the chair, since I didn't succeed quite, but almost. Thanks all of you for all these excellent reflections. I would like to ask for a warm round of applause for our speakers. And thanks to all of you for coming. We look forward to further debate these things with you. So, thank you. Ciao.